Jeffrey Stacey, who also joins us from Washington. He is a former State Department official and national security consultant. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. How did we actually get here now to have senators openly admit that they will not be impartial jurors in spite of, taking an oath, and to have such a crucial process actually rendered kind of farcical by partisan politics?
Well, you've got to think about the country that we have today in the U.S. About half of the country has been swallowing Russian propaganda for about 3 years now. And that has, more than anything else, and a lot of our journalists here are not quite willing to cover this in sufficient detail, but that means that about 40% of the country, 38 to be precise, is in lockstep with this president, who is in lockstep with some foreign adversaries. But moving on to what you'd rather talk about specifically, you've got 4 to 6, possibly 8 Republican senators who privately at a lunch yesterday made clear to McConnell that they did not want to squelch all opportunities for witnesses and documentary evidence. So we're seeing a bit of a play now. They've extended the time of the proceeding, of the trial, and what we're all waiting to see is when they're going to plan to strike. The key thing is, it looks as if they're completely going for this scam or cover-up or whatever you want to call it, but that's because each one of them is trying to duck under the radar of Trump's tweets to his base. Some of these senators are up for re-election. Others don't want, Trump-like challengers in their next primaries. So really, they're doing a kind of duck and cover, but they plan to pop up right at the right time, or so we understand here in Washington.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I'm trying to understand here if there's any potential whatsoever for those Republican senators to somehow change course and decide we want to see the evidence, we want to hear witnesses. Not saying we're going to vote to remove the president, but we just think it's fair to hear this. Not that we're on the Democrat side or anything. Do you think that could happen in big enough numbers to actually change the course of this trial?
We do. We are not making predictions. I'm not going to sit here and say there's a 50%, 75% chance of that happening. It's probably lower. But yesterday at that lunch, it was made clear the moderates began speaking up to McConnell. And already, you've seen him budge on some key things. For example, yesterday, he and Schumer, who haven't spoken for weeks, finally began talking, and they talked about, for example, a 1-for-1 or 2-for-2 deal on witnesses. That means that McConnell knows he doesn't have the final vote to completely shut out witnesses. Now, you asked a deeper question. Can I predict whether the evidence coming from any of those witnesses will be enough to move 20 Republicans in order to get a removal vote in what is now actually looking like it may end up becoming a real trial? Day by day, it should begin to look more like that. That question, I'm not about to make a grand prediction, but we've seen some things here that we've never predicted. So the prediction game is really not one to be in Washington at this moment in time.
It's fascinating. I want to ask you a much broader question, if I can. Some say Trump won the presidency in the first place because Americans think the system is broken. Is there any chance now, because of all the chaos that we've seen of the 2 years over his presidency, all the partisanship, is there any chance now that there might be a push for real reform, real changes? I mean, even to the Electoral College, for example, which is just such an kind of an antiquated system that gives, a voter in Wisconsin more power than a voter in California. It's really not in step with democracy today. Again, any chance any of this could open the gates to let democracy reform take place in America?
You're asking the toughest, more long-term questions that really any of us are anticipating right here in the middle of impeachment finally underway. But the long answer is yes, there is. But it's going to be years, if not over a decade and stretching to 2, right now, Washington and American political elites in legislatures across the country, governorships, both parties, they see the malfeasance at the highest levels. They see the interference from Russia and others. They see the challenge coming from China, stealing all our intellectual property, etc. And what this will take is majorities of the Democratic Party and a Democratic president. Only when you have those three things can rules that have only been informal for not just decades, but even centuries here, surrounding the presidency and the separation of powers, when laws can be made to basically deal with all the norms and rules and informal kind of stipulations that have all gone by the wayside by a president who is hell-bent on having his way and meting out any punishment to anyone who stands in his way, it will be well after he's retiring on a golf course somewhere near Mar-a-Lago, potentially, or wherever else. Or fancy this, Donald Trump ends up living in Russia in a decade. That's when we'll probably see the kind of reforms that you're talking about. And yes, it will take time, but as Winston Churchill said about the U.S., it doesn't always do the right thing, but it ultimately ends up doing something that approximates that in time.
Okay, Jeffrey, Stacey, thank you so much for joining us with your insight there from Washington. We appreciate it.